Hey there everybody, Eric from Outer Limitless coming at you today with another video. Now I'm out here today, it's getting quite cold outside and it's going to be a good hard test for the production samples of the Work Tough Gear Woodscraft Chanto. Now if you took a look at one of my prior videos, I went through this in detail and compared this production sample against the original prototype to show you the differences, some of the subtleties, little bit of geometry, blade geometry, and some fine details, but in today's video we're going to get down to testing. Now in the prior video I did discuss the fact that there are two versions of the production sample. This one here in a black traction coating, this has the grind pretty much set up the way that I originally designed it, but what it means is, well, on this production sample we ended up with a little bit of a thicker edge down at the bottom at the secondary bevel. It's a little bit thick behind the edge, but at the same time still going to be a nice balanced knife. But Work Tough Gear playing around with a couple of different grinds. This one here, this has the black wash finish, and you'll notice if you look real close, this does have a higher grind. Instead of the saber grind starting below the fuller, it actually starts up inside the fuller, and what that means is by the time the grind makes it down to the back side of that secondary bevel, it's actually a little bit thinner than on the traction coated version. Now both of these being thicker than the original prototype. The prototype was a little bit thin. We wanted to beef the knife up just a bit, get a little bit thicker on the tip, and make sure it was going to be good and durable for harder use. Now, if there's one thing that I enjoy about my wilderness knives, it's making fire. That is really predominantly what I do with my hard use fixed blades. Tons and tons of fire prep. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to go through the process. We're going to do a bunch of fire prep, and then I'm going to do some additional testing of these after the fact just to see which one performs, and we'll get a pretty good impression of this. But with that said, I have a whole bunch to do and a whole bunch to share with you, and if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about what I'm about to get into, do me a favor, stay tuned. Now before we get too far, I would like to say thank you very much to the people at Work Tough Gear for making this all possible, building this beautiful knife for me. I really do appreciate it. So as I mentioned here, the Work Tough Gear Woodscraft Chanto production samples. Now we're going to do a bunch of firecraft here. I'm going to start with some batoning, we're going to get into some carving, and by the end of this I am definitely going to do some chopping. Now I don't necessarily need to do the chopping for my fire prep tasks, but I absolutely want to. For me, it's definitely something that's going to help to differentiate these two models. Now keep in mind again, one has sort of a lower saber grind, the other with a higher saber grind, the other being a little thicker behind the edge, a little thinner on this one. So the geometry is a little bit different. How is that going to translate in each one of these tests? That's what I'm trying to find out, so that long term, when I go to the final production run, now the first production run is going to have both of these in it. That's the first thing. So you'll see both of these perform. Both of these are going to be available in the first production run. But long term, what does the model really end up being? So we're going to get some feedback from customers. I'm going to learn some things myself. All I know is this is absolutely going to be a blast. Now I'm going to get started with the black traction coating. Keep in mind again, this is the one with my original detail with the grind starting below the fuller. So it's a little bit thicker behind the edge, a little bit more mass. Now I have to limb up this Christmas tree behind me. It's the end of the season. Got to get this out of here. And even though it's not technically part of my fire prep, I thought this would be a place for me to start. And so as you can see there, pretty much gliding right down and through. A couple mishits on my part, but that's the key with the Chanto. The Chanto having this nice second grind, it really aids in snap cuts and just doing a fantastic job just slicing right through the limbs. So this one here, the traction coating, let's turn it over to the stone wash finish and see how that one does. So both versions performing well. I do have to say, I think this did perform just a little bit better. A little bit lighter feeling, hard to say, but at the same time, seems to have gone through each branch just a little cleaner. It's really hard to tell. And it did struggle a little bit. I left some longer branches behind that I had to kind of contend and work around. So the footage might be deceiving, but my general impression so far, I think this version just a little bit better for the limbing tasks there. All right, now for the batoning tasks. I'm going to try to do this in a little bit of a demonstrative type of way. We'll see how it goes. Starting here with the traction coating, and we're just going to establish a crack to get this started. Now, the Chanto with more than enough length to span most wood that you're going to want to baton. One thing that I did have a concern with the original design, just the strength of the tip. Now, I did absolutely pound on the tip. If you go back to my original prototype testing, there were no problems, but we did make it a little bit thicker. I would suggest to users just being a little mindful, not blowing directly on the tip of the knife. Bring it in just a little bit to where you have a little bit more thickness. You'll never have a problem. This is meant to be able to handle this, but again, just bring your baton back and try not to hit directly on the tip. Now here, as I establish my crack, we're going to watch how this translates down the wood. So taking my time here. And here you can see a nice splitting action. Again, with the high saber grind, this is going to do a nice job. It's roughly 2/3 of the way up the blade height, which is, in my opinion, about the perfect place for a saber grind if you want to use it for batoning. But you'll notice getting that crack established, translating all the way down, basically to the bottom of the piece. I mean, the batoning at this point is pretty much done. I could pretty much pry this apart with my hands, but just finishing this off, no problem. So traction coating here, not binding up, doing pretty good, and we'll check this at the end to see how it holds up. Again, no problem translating that crack all the way down to the bottom of the wood. Again, I mean, this is pretty much all the way through, so no problem. This wood is a little bit frozen. It's been out here for a while. It is perfectly seasoned, so no worries there, but it is just a little bit frozen today. Nice and clean. Tracking nicely straight down through the piece. This is a fairly straight grain wood. This is red oak, so fairly straight grain. So this version with the traction coating, very good. I mean, in terms of the splitting capabilities, fantastic. And now for the stonewash finish, this is the higher grind, very similar piece of wood. I mean, the grain structure, just about exactly the same type of wood and everything, so should be a pretty fair test. So again, I'm just going to establish the crack. This piece is either frozen or the knife does not perform as well. We'll find out. So again, translating the crack down the wood, this is definitely using more of my energy to get it done. It'll go. I just have to hit it a little harder. And this grain might be just a little bit more twisty, but we'll keep at it. I mean, looking at the grain here, it's just as straight as the other piece. So I think this is a pretty fair test. Without going too much further, I'm going to say already the traction coating version doing a little bit better for splitting, but we're going to keep going through it and see how this is by the end. Now again, establishing that crack, this wasn't too bad. Getting it set, and now you can see that crack going all the way down the wood. Not taking any effort at all. So that's better. Feel better about this now. So there you go. Nice. Doing a nice job tracking right down the wood, good and straight, so splitting very nice. So all in all, both versions doing a fairly good job. I would say that the acid stonewash finish here with the higher grind, definitely not quite as good. I mean, by a little bit, but the traction coating definitely doing a nice job. I think one thing to consider is that now that the grind is up into the fuller, the knife doesn't wedge past the fuller quite as easy. With the traction coating version, where the grind on the saber grind actually starts below the fuller, that means the crack translates past the fuller. In this case, there is a good amount of wear right up against the edge of the fuller, which shows me that that's where the bulk of the blade is actually binding and rubbing. And that means that the crack is starting in the fuller, so to speak. And this section here on the fuller, you can see, has a lot of wood deposited on it, which makes me concerned that it's actually kind of binding the knife just a little bit as it works down the crack. But still more to be figured out, I think, in this department. And so just real quick, as I try to illustrate my point here, where my saber grind ends below the fuller, and you can see there is a good amount of wear right here on the traction coating. So that's where the splitting action is happening. And that means that the crack at this point is open through the fuller area and a little bit less rubbing on the top of the knife. Now you can see obviously it is rubbing, but the bulk of the work is happening right there. And I'm afraid that the top of the fuller could act as a little bit of a stop and really catch on the wood if I'm not careful. Now you can see here, this is the acid stonewash finish. Again, the bulk of the cracking action happening at the edge of the fuller instead of below the fuller. And what that means is the crack is still developing through the fuller and towards the top of the knife. So I think this version is binding up just a little more. And as you look at the width of how wide this area is that is actually touching the wood, versus here, it's not really touching so much, which tells me that the wood is really opening up quicker on the lower grind versus the higher grind. And that's to be expected. I mean, imagine if this knife was a full flat grind, what that would mean. It would mean the entire blade would touch the wood as it goes through batoning. So I think this grind is a little more effective for the actual batoning tasks, But again, more tests to be performed. Now, certainly the splitting tasks are only going to be part of the story. What about the carving? Well, you got to imagine with something like the Chanto, we're trying to strike that balance between all-around capability. So the chopping and splitting capability, but also the carving. So here with the traction coating, keep in mind this is going to have a thicker grind behind the edge. So your convex edge is going to be maybe a little broader, but let's see how this does. Trying to plane down the wood. I'm just going fairly light to get started here. Finding the edge, not too bad. Now, a very important detail, and this is something to keep in mind. We made a significant difference, and I forgot to talk about this in the last video, and I'll demonstrate this with some B-roll. But if you look down here, right where you index into the choil, we thinned this out. So instead of the area near the ricasso flaring out, it now tapers in. And that makes a massive difference in the carving comfort over long, prolonged use. So this to me is going to feel much more comfortable in the hand, and I am absolutely pumped about that. So when you compare this against the original prototype, you can clearly see the difference in how that came out. So take a look at that. Pretty substantial difference. And that's really going to translate to your overall comfort for long-term use. But again, running this down the wood, I can tell you that this edge definitely feels broader than on the original model. I've used that quite a bit, and at this point I have a very good muscle memory as to how that felt. This isn't bad, it's just not quite the same. If I need to, I can start to get in a little bit deeper here. And this knife is definitely nice and balanced in the hand, so it definitely feels really good for these carving tasks. It's not going to be too forward weighted to the point where you fatigue. It actually feels much lighter than it is. So just some curls there to get things started. I mean, not too bad. You can see here, nice little pile. That worked out okay. But I do feel as though the edge just a little bit broad. And now with the stonewash version, well, let's see. Same exact idea, much different edge geometry. I can feel it already, and I think you can even hear it. This is a lot closer to what the original was. You can see actually doing a nicer job grabbing curls. That feels really good. So from a carving capability, this to me is definitely doing it. I like the thickness behind the edge here. I believe if I go back to my prior footage, it's roughly 1.5 millimeters ballpark versus on the traction coating version, which was closer to like 1.8 or 1.9. So definitely getting quite thick behind the edge on the traction coating version. You can see here I'm able to get mighty fine little curls, much finer than on the traction coated version. So this is feeling pretty good to me. Both doing just fine. It's a matter of just detail and kind of what your objectives are. So I'm wondering if in the final design I can kind of strike the balance between these two, get that saber grind established, but yet keep the thickness behind the edge closer to this 0.15. I think that would be the happy middle ground. But yeah, so that's the fine curls, no problem. Digging a little deeper here. So yeah, here you can see these curls here are actually much finer. When you look at how thin these are, that's nice and thin. That's going to catch real easy. You can see here, these are much thicker. So Not that the traction coating version did a bad job, it's just different. So you can see each one of these versions having its pros and cons, and I'm hoping by the end of this process I can kind of get the best of both of these to make the sort of ultimate middle ground combination. Now, another significant improvement, sharpening the spine. That was something that was not done on the original prototype, as I do intend on generally having at least a 2-knife system. So I didn't intend on this being a 1-tool option, but I've since changed my mind. I think this is going to be a nice addition to this knife. So at this point, getting into the scraping tasks now, you can see that we specifically put this thumb scallop on the side. That's for your alternate grips and the ability to bear on the side of the blade with comfort, so your thumb literally fits in there just about perfect. And now getting into these scraping tasks. So this one with the traction coating. Clearly, that works absolutely wonderfully. So just about perfect. And now the acid stonewash finish. Let's get a good edge. Now, it's hard to say just by looking at the results. However, I can tell you by feel, the acid stonewash finished version actually did a nicer job. It scraped a little bit harder, and I believe the reason for that is because there's actually a little bit of the traction coating all the way up to the edge, which just softens that edge a tiny little bit. It's subtle, but just enough where you don't end up with any of that on top of the finish here. There's no coating up to the edge, and I can feel actually that it feels just a little more square to me. So in my opinion, I am not a big fan of traction coatings. Work Tuff Gear has been experimenting with this finish. They're calling it their, I believe, slick finish. Personally, I'm not a big fan of traction coatings, but they did want to use it for this model, and I'm going to give them that support. So, you know, I agreed, and I don't know. To me, it's not the best for a working finish on a knife. That's just my opinion, and you can see it does impact the scraping ability just a little bit. So for me, I prefer the uncoated blade, and yeah, that definitely feels sharper in my opinion. Now, there's a lot of funny little tasks that you can leverage your knife for in the Firecraft and Woodscraft application. I always personally like using mine as sort of an extension of my hands. That works out very well with the forward portion of the knife where it is flat. This is not like other blades where sometimes you have curves where everything is straight on this. And keep in mind, I heard a lot of people say Chantos cannot be used in the wilderness or woodscraft application. And honestly, that was my inspiration for even starting this in the first place. It was like, well, why? I mean, a Chanto is a great blade. You end up with a nice straight edge, good and easy to control. It's like a repeatable result the entire length, so you know what you're getting into. You can use it as a draw knife. You get this wicked edge here. So I mean, that snap cut sort of mentality definitely coming into play. This nice long piercing tip if you had to defend yourself against an animal, or if you were in a hunting situation and you had to sort of put it down. You can definitely use this to pry a little bit. I'm going to do some more significant tip testing with this to see how far I can push it. But I mean, yeah, overall, just really nice. And for little things like, you know, squaring up your pile and getting your little tinder nice and ready, I mean, that's just perfect. So funny little things you can do with your knife when you're getting ready to process a fire, and I think the Chanto does it well. Now I generally like using some fat wood if I have it available. So here, again, this is the traction coated version. Getting on that edge, just sliding nicely down the wood. I mean, this feels really good, really comfortable. I don't not like this grind. I don't want people to get that impression. It's just different from what I'm used to. It's a little broader. It's not a bad thing. It's just a matter of getting used to it. And you can see here, definitely doing a nice job. Beautifully running right down, taking some healthy pieces. This is going to be instrumental in helping me start my fire here. Fat wood's always nice to test the edge of a knife, see how it feels. It kind of carves differently than most wood, just because it's got that resin factor in it. Kind of pulls away a little bit different, but yeah, you can see here, nice, tight, fine little pieces. Now I'm going to get some healthier chunks here. And you can see, good and effective. And last but not least, doing a little bit of scraping here, so getting some of this fuzz. Just gotta plane myself down a nice flat spot to establish. That will do it. And that right there will definitely do it. So, working out very well, doing a nice job with the traction coated version. But now with the stonewash version, kind of retraining my muscles, changing the edge geometry and my planing attack here. Again, doing a nice job. I'm actually not being quite as dainty with my curls. Let me lighten up a bit. There we go. There we go. Feeling real good there. Getting some nice pieces. Slide those off to the side. It's got some slightly thicker chunks. My piece is getting a little thin here, but there you go. I do have to say, on the fat wood, the traction coating version, feeling pretty good. I mean, this is obviously doing a nice job, but I was definitely happy with the performance on the other knife as well. So now here, and just a subtlety, but you can kind of see it. These pieces are a little bit different potentially in terms of the resin content, but when you compare the traction coating version against the acid stonewash version, you can see just a little bit thinner I'm able to get with that stonewash version. Not a huge deal. But now again, doing the scraping. So I'm just going to plane myself down a flat surface to get started, and that should do it. And you can hear how deep this version just grinding into that. I mean, it's like scouring this away, making some real serious fluff here. I mean, look at the amount that came off of this. When you look at this piece, it's just so flat now. This really just ripping away the fluff. So that did a fantastic job. So these pieces being a little long for my work Tuff stove, got to cut them in half. There's only one way to approach this. Traction coating first. You can see the cut here, pretty clean. Made it halfway through and then kind of snapped. And now the stonewash version. Piece is a little thicker. Both versions doing just fine. Really hard to tell the difference. I mean, if I had to call it, I'd say maybe the traction coated version, but at the same time, the wood wasn't exactly the same size pieces either. So both of them doing just fine. Now, when it comes to the stabbing capability of the Chanto, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing when you need to defend yourself. It's a little bit of a curse when you're trying to stab down through wood to split it. It stabs so deep. The fine point is going to go right through the wood, down into your bearing surface, and not give you the real good cracking capability. That's a little bit of a downfall, but at the same time, you can still do it. Traction coated version. And as you see, you kind of need to stab down and actually twist the wood itself. Popped off, but it did it. And now for the stonewash finish. Nice thick piece here. I do have to say, I'm extremely happy with the handle shape, geometry, how it feels in the hand, and in this case, the lockup. I mean, positive lockup, just feels really good. Nice and secure, and no worries that I'm gonna slip. So I'm really only going to start my fire once, but I did split my pile into 2 sections. So I'm going to use both knives just to scrape the ferro rod, get my tinder bundle started and see how it goes. But got my work Tuff stove here, all lined up, ready to go. So traction coating first. Some fresh fluff from the fat wood. Now the sharpened spine does go all the way along the tip of the knife. For me personally, I do like to strike a little bit closer, up towards my thumb. So leveraging this should go pretty straightforward. I might scrape just a little bit of the magnesium off the rod here. You can see it's already trying to light, so I'm just going to go right at it here. pretty easy. And this is the other thing that I like about having a knife of this length. Very easy to help me leverage it. And again, just a little extension of my body here. And that is nicely underway. So now running the same scenario with the stonewash version. Again, just gonna plane down here, get myself some fresh fluff off of the fat wood. And again, you can just hear that scraping capability. This just ripping this. I mean, awesome. And I mean, in no time, just really making a nice amount of that fluff. But now with the ferro rod, simple. I mean, just so easy. All right, so fire is well established at this point. Stove's coming up to temperature, and that means I can get into a little bit of torture testing with these Chantos.